The wheat was dying. Eliza Thornfield stood at the edge of her 40 acres, watching the stalks bend and shiver in the late afternoon wind. They weren't supposed to look like that in July, thin, pale, rattling like bones. She'd planted them herself back in April, working the plow until her hands bled, because there was no one else to do it. There hadn't been anyone else for 2 years now. She ran her boot through the dust. No rain in 3 weeks. The creek behind the house had gone down to a trickle, barely enough to keep the chickens watered. The garden she'd tried to start had shriveled up by June, and now the wheat, the only crop that mattered, the only thing standing between her and complete ruin, was turning brown at the edges. You gonna stand there all day, or you gonna do something about it? Eliza didn't turn around. She knew that voice. Naomi Crawford, her closest neighbor, though close meant a 3-mile ride. Naomi had a way of showing up exactly when Eliza didn't want company, which was most of the time. "There's nothing to do," Eliza said. "It needs rain. I can't make it rain." "No, but you can stop pretending you're going to make it through another winter alone." Now Eliza did turn. Naomi sat on her horse, a sturdy bay mare, looking down at her with that expression she always wore, half concern, half exasperation. Naomi was 10 years older, built solid, with gray streaking through her dark hair. She'd buried one husband to cholera and married another within a year, a practical arrangement that had worked out well enough. She had strong opinions about how other women should live, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. "I've made it this far," Eliza said. "Barely." Naomi swung down from the saddle, her boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. "I saw John Miller at the trading post last week. He asked about you again." "No." "He's got a good setup, Eliza. 2 sections of land, a real house, cattle." "I said no." Naomi sighed. "You can't keep doing this. You're wearing yourself down to nothing. Look at you. When's the last time you had a decent meal? When's the last time you slept through a whole night without waking up to check if something's gone wrong?" Eliza crossed her arms. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're surviving, and that's not the same thing." Naomi stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I know what happened. I know why you don't trust easily. But Thomas has been gone for 2 years, and David—" "Don't." The word came out sharp, cutting. "Don't say his name." Naomi held up her hands. All right. But you've got to face facts. This farm is too much for one person. The land's no good without irrigation, and you don't have the money to dig a well. Winter's coming whether you're ready or not. And if that wheat doesn't come in, you won't have enough to sell for supplies. You'll be eating snow by February." Eliza knew all of this. She lived it every day. But hearing someone else say it out loud made it feel heavier, more real. "What do you want me to do?" she asked quietly. "I want you to stop being so damn stubborn." Naomi softened a little. "Look, I'm not saying you have to marry John Miller. I'm not saying you have to marry anybody. But you need help, Eliza. You need something to change." "Like what?" Naomi hesitated. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper, worn at the edges. "There's another option, if you're willing to consider it." Eliza took the paper. It was a copy of the Matrimonial News, one of those publications that circulated through the territories, full of advertisements from men looking for wives and women looking for stability. She'd seen them before. She'd never paid them any attention. "You can't be serious," she said. "Why not? Plenty of women do it. My cousin in Oregon answered one of these ads 5 years ago, and she's doing just fine now. Got herself a decent man, a good home. Your cousin got lucky." "Maybe. Or maybe she was smart enough to take a chance when she needed to." Naomi tapped the paper. "There's one in there I marked for you, a carpenter from Missouri. He's looking to move west, wants a partner, not a servant. Says he's honest about what he can offer and what he can't. No promises of riches, no flowery talk, just a straightforward man looking for a straightforward woman." Eliza stared at the paper. The idea was absurd. Writing to a stranger, inviting some man she'd never met into her life, onto her land, trusting him not to be another David, another liar, another mistake. "I don't need a man," she said. "You need something," Naomi countered, "and you're running out of time to figure out what that is." She left the paper in Eliza's hands and walked back to her horse. Before she mounted, she looked back over her shoulder. "Just think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking." Then she rode off, leaving Eliza standing in the dust with the dying wheat and a newspaper she didn't want. That night, Eliza sat at the small table in her kitchen, the lantern flickering beside her. The house was quiet except for the wind rattling the shutters. It was always quiet now. She'd gotten used to it mostly. Sometimes she even preferred it. No one to argue with, no one to disappoint, no one to lose. She unfolded the newspaper and found the advertisement Naomi had marked. Seeking correspondence with a woman of practical mind and steady character. "I'm a carpenter by trade, 34 years old, experienced in building and repair work. I own no land but have savings enough to start fresh. I do not promise wealth or easy living, only honest labor and fair treatment. If you are willing to work beside a man rather than behind him, I would welcome your letter. Caleb Ward, Springfield, Missouri." Eliza read it 3 times. It wasn't flowery, it wasn't romantic, it didn't make any grand claims or offer any dreams, it was just plain, matter of fact, the kind of thing a tired man might write after a long day when he didn't have the energy to pretend. She liked that, despite herself, but liking it and doing something about it were 2 different things. She set the paper down and got up to check the stove. The fire had burned low. She added another log, even though she probably shouldn't. Wood was getting scarce, and she'd need to make it last through winter. But the nights were still cold, even in summer, and she couldn't sleep when she was cold. She thought about Thomas, her late husband. He'd been a good man, in his way. Steady, reliable. He'd bought this land with big plans that died with him when his horse threw him into a ravine 3 years ago. She'd been 24 then, already worn down by failed harvests and hard seasons. His death had just made everything harder. And then there was David. She didn't like to think about David, but sometimes, late at night, when the house was too quiet and the memories too loud, he crept back into her mind. The neighbor who'd offered to help her after Thomas died. The man who'd smiled and said all the right things, who'd made her believe she wasn't alone. The man who'd kissed her once, promised her everything, and then disappeared with half her savings and the only decent horse she'd had left. That had been 1.5 years ago. She hadn't trusted anyone since. She went back to the table and picked up the newspaper again. If you're willing to work beside a man rather than behind him. That was the part that stuck with her. Not the promises. Not the offers. Just that one line, suggesting something different. Partnership, not ownership. She pulled out a piece of paper, old, creased, one of the last clean sheets she had, and a pencil. She stared at the blank page for a long time. Then she started writing. "See, Mr. Ward, I am writing in response to your advertisement. I will be direct, as you were. I am 27 years old. I own 40 acres in the Dakota Territory, though own might be generous. The land owns me more than I own it. My husband died 3 years ago. I have no children. I work the farm alone, and it is failing. I do not know what I am looking for in writing to you. I do not believe in easy answers or kind strangers. I have been disappointed before, and I have learned to expect disappointment, but I'm also practical enough to know that I cannot continue as I am. If you are serious about your offer, if you are truly looking for partnership and not convenience, then I am willing to correspond. But I will not lie to you, and I expect the same honesty in return. I have no patience for pretty words or false hope. If that suits you, write back. If not, I understand." Eliza Thornfield. She read it over twice, then folded it before she could change her mind. The next morning, she rode into town and posted it. She didn't tell Naomi. She didn't tell anyone. She just sent it and tried not to think about it. But she did think about it. Every day for 2 weeks, she thought about it. Every time she rode into town for supplies, she checked for a reply. And every time there was nothing, she told herself it was for the best. He'd probably read her letter and decided she was too hard, too bitter, too broken. Fine. She was used to being alone. Then, on a hot afternoon in early August, the postmaster handed her an envelope. Her hands shook as she opened it. "Mrs. Thornfield, thank you for your letter. I appreciate your honesty, and I will try to match it. I am not looking for someone to save. I am not looking for someone to fix me. I had a wife once. She died in childbirth, along with our son, 4 years ago. I have worked every day since then because working keeps me from thinking too much. But working is not the same as living, and I am tired of the difference. I do not expect you to trust me. I do not expect anything except the chance to prove I mean what I say. If you are willing to keep writing, I am willing to keep answering. If you decide this is a mistake, I will not blame you. I cannot offer you wealth. I cannot promise your land will thrive or that life will be easy, but I can promise that I will not lie to you, and I will not leave unless you ask me to. If that is enough to continue, then I am here. Caleb Ward. Eliza sat on the porch and read the letter 4 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years, but something in her chest loosened just a little, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something other than tired. The letters came slowly at first. One every 2 weeks, then one a week, then 2. They were never long, neither of them wasted words, but they were real. Caleb wrote about his work, the houses he built, the clients who paid late or not at all. Eliza wrote about the farm, the wheat that kept dying, the chickens that refused to lay. They didn't talk about feelings or the future. They talked about survival. But somewhere between the lines, something else started to grow. Caleb told her about the barn he'd built for a widow in Missouri, how she'd paid him in preserves and bread because she didn't have cash. Eliza told him about the fence she'd tried to repair and how it had collapsed the next day because the wood was rotten. He told her about losing his wife, about the guilt that came with still being alive. She told him about David, about the shame of being fooled, of letting someone in only to have them take everything. They were careful with each other, but they were honest. And slowly, carefully, Eliza started to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be different. It was late September when Caleb's letter arrived with a question that changed everything. I have been thinking about coming west, not because I expect anything from you, but because there is nothing left for me here. I have saved enough to travel and to start over. If I came to the Dakota Territory, would you be willing to meet me? No promises, no obligations. Just a meeting so we can see if what we have written is real. If the answer is no, I will understand. But if the answer is yes, I will come. Eliza sat with that letter for 3 days. She walked the fields, she checked the wheat, which had somehow managed to produce a thin, struggling harvest. She fed the chickens. She repaired the leaking roof. She did all the things she always did, and the whole time Caleb's question sat in the back of her mind like a weight. Meeting him meant risk. It meant opening the door to someone new, someone who could hurt her, leave her, take from her. It meant trusting again, and she wasn't sure she had any trust left to give. But not meeting him meant staying exactly as she was, alone, struggling, slowly losing ground. It meant safety, but it also meant surrender. On the 3rd night, she sat down and wrote back, "Come. That is my answer. Just come. I do not know what will happen when you arrive. I do not know if this is wise or foolish, but I'm tired of being afraid, and I'm tired of being alone. So come, and we will see what happens. Eliza." She posted the letter the next morning, and then she waited. Caleb arrived on a cold afternoon in mid-October. Eliza saw him coming from a long way off, a single rider on a steady horse, carrying a pack and leading a second horse loaded with tools. She stood on the porch and watched him approach, her heart beating harder than she wanted to admit. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair going gray at the temples. His face was weathered, lined with years of work and sun. He didn't smile when he reached the house. He just dismounted, took off his hat, and looked at her. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said. "Mr. Ward." They stood there for a moment, taking each other in. Eliza had imagined this meeting 100 times, but none of her imaginings had prepared her for the reality of it, the awkwardness, the uncertainty, the strange feeling of standing face to face with someone she'd only known through words. "You came a long way," she said finally. "I did." "Was it worth it?" He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I think so, but I guess we'll find out." Eliza felt something tight in her chest ease, just a little. "I guess we will." She stepped aside. "You can put your horses in the barn. There's not much room, but they'll be out of the wind. I'll make coffee." "Thank you." He led the horses away, and Eliza went inside. Her hands were shaking. She didn't know why. This was just a meeting, just a conversation. Nothing had to come of it. She could still send him away if she wanted to. But when he came back inside and sat down at her table, when he wrapped his hands around the cup of coffee she gave him and looked at her with those steady, tired eyes, she knew she wasn't going to send him away. Not yet. They talked for hours that first night. Not about anything important, just small things. The journey, the weather, the differences between Missouri and Dakota. Caleb was quiet, deliberate in his words, but he wasn't cold. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, he meant what he said. Eliza found herself relaxing, bit by bit. She'd expected him to push, to ask for things, to try to charm or convince her, but he didn't. He just sat there, drank his coffee, and let the silence settle when it needed to. "You can stay in the barn tonight, Shun," she said finally. "It's not much, but it's dry. That's fine. Tomorrow, if you want, you can look at the farm. See what needs fixing. There's a lot." I figured there would be. She met his eyes. "I'm not promising anything, Mr. Ward. You understand that, right? You came all this way, and I'm still not promising anything." "I know," he said. "I didn't come for promises." "Then why did you come?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I was tired of writing letters, and because I wanted to see if you were real." And a faint smile touched his lips, the first she'd seen. "You're real." The next morning, Caleb walked the property with her. He didn't say much, but she saw him taking it all in. The struggling fields, the broken fences, the sagging roof of the barn, the well that had gone nearly dry. He ran his hands over the wood, tested the posts, checked the soil. "It's not as bad as you think," he said finally. Eliza raised an eyebrow. "It's pretty bad." "It's fixable. It'll take work, but it's fixable. I don't have money to pay you." "I didn't ask for money." She stopped walking and looked at him. "Then what are you asking for?" Caleb turned to face her. He was quiet for a long moment, and she saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Something raw, something real. "A reason to stay," he said quietly. "That's all. Just a reason." Eliza felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say something sharp, something that would push him back, keep him at a distance. But she couldn't, because she understood what he was asking for. She'd been looking for the same thing. "I can't give you promises," she said. "I can't give you guarantees. I don't know if this will work. I don't even know if I want it to work." "I know. But if you want to stay, if you want to try." She took a breath. "Then stay." Caleb nodded slowly. "All right. All right." They stood there in the cold wind, two broken people who didn't know how to be anything else, and made a choice that neither of them fully understood. Hwitzi. Caleb started working the next day. He fixed the barn roof first, replacing the rotted boards and sealing the gaps. Then he moved on to the fences, reinforcing the posts and restringing the wire. He worked quietly, methodically, never asking for direction, just seeing what needed to be done and doing it. Eliza watched him from the house. She didn't help at first. She had her own work. And besides, she wasn't sure she wanted to get too close. But as the days went on, she found herself drifting outside more often, standing near where he was working, asking questions, offering observations. He never pushed. He never asked her to do anything she didn't offer. But slowly she started working beside him. They didn't talk much, but the work itself became a kind of conversation, a rhythm they fell into without planning. He'd hand her a tool before she asked for it. She'd hold a board steady while he hammered. They moved around each other like people who'd been doing this for years, even though it had only been days. One afternoon, as they were repairing a section of fence near the creek, Caleb paused and looked out over the land. "You could grow more than wheat here," he said. "Like what?" "Vegetables, a bigger garden, maybe some fruit trees if you could get water to them. The soil's not bad, it just needs help." "I tried a garden. It died." "You tried it alone." He looked at her. "That's different." Eliza didn't answer, but she thought about it. The first storm came in early November. It started as a low pressure in the west, a dark line on the horizon that Eliza recognized immediately. She'd seen enough prairie storms to know what was coming. She started securing everything she could, bringing the chickens into the barn, tying down the shutters, moving anything loose inside. Caleb saw what she was doing and joined in without a word. Together, they worked fast, racing the wind. The storm hit just after sunset. It came in hard and violent, the way prairie storms do. Wind that screamed and tore at everything, rain that fell like bullets, lightning that split the sky open. Eliza and Caleb huddled in the house, listening to the world outside come apart. "The wheat," Eliza said suddenly. Caleb looked at her. "What?" "The winter wheat. I planted it 2 weeks ago. If the wind tears it up now, it won't survive. There's nothing you can do about it in this. There has to be." She stood up, heading for the door. Caleb caught her arm. "Eliza, you can't go out there. If I lose that wheat, I lose everything. I won't make it through winter. And if you go out there, you might not make it through the night." She pulled her arm free. "Then I guess that's my choice." She grabbed her coat and opened the door. The wind nearly ripped it off its hinges. Rain slammed into her face, cold and stinging. She could barely see 3 feet in front of her. Behind her, she heard Caleb swear. Then he was beside her, pulling on his own coat. "What are you doing?" she shouted over the wind. "What does it look like? This isn't your fight." He looked at her, rain streaming down his face. "Yes, it is." And then he was running toward the field, and she was running after him. They worked in the dark, in the screaming wind, trying to save what they could. The wheat field was a mess, stalks bent and broken, soil washing away in rivers. Caleb found boards and stakes in the barn and started building windbreaks, driving them into the ground with a hammer, his hands bleeding from the effort. Eliza worked beside him, holding the boards steady, digging trenches to divert the water. Her fingers went numb. Her clothes were soaked through. She couldn't feel her feet, but she didn't stop. At some point, Caleb slipped in the mud and went down hard. Eliza heard him cry out and turned to see him clutching his side, his face twisted in pain. "Caleb!" She dropped what she was holding and ran to him. He was on his hands and knees, breathing hard. "I'm fine," he gasped. "You're not fine. You're hurt. It's just a bruise. We need to get you inside. Not until we're done." "Caleb?" He looked up at her, rain streaming down his face, and she saw something in his eyes that stopped her cold. Determination, stubbornness. The same thing she saw in herself every time she looked in the mirror. "Not until we're done," he said again. So they kept working. By the time the storm finally passed, just before dawn, they were both exhausted, soaked, and shaking from cold. But the wheat field had windbreaks. The water had been diverted. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. They stumbled back to the house and collapsed inside. Eliza built up the fire while Caleb peeled off his wet coat, wincing as he moved. She saw the way he held his side and knew it was worse than he'd admitted. "Let me see," she said. "It's fine. Let me see, Caleb." He hesitated, then lifted his shirt. There was a dark bruise spreading across his ribs, angry and swollen. Eliza sucked in a breath. "You might have cracked something," she said. "Probably. And you kept working anyway." "So did you." She looked up at him, and for the first time she saw the truth of what he'd done. He'd risked himself for her. Not because he had to, not because he expected anything in return, but because her fight had become his fight, and he wasn't the kind of man who walked away. Something broke open inside her, something she'd been holding closed for years. She reached up and touched his face, her hand shaking. "Why did you do that?" Caleb looked at her, his eyes steady and tired and real. "Because I'm not going anywhere, Eliza, not unless you tell me to." And then she saw it, a single tear sliding down his face. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't hide it. He just let it fall, honest and unhidden. And in that moment, she knew. She kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't perfect. It was desperate and raw and full of everything she'd been holding back. And when he kissed her back, wrapping his arms around her despite the pain in his ribs, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. They didn't talk about what happened that night. They didn't need to. The next morning, Caleb was up early despite his injury, checking the field, assessing the damage. Eliza made coffee and watched him through the window, her heart still racing from the night before. When he came back inside, she handed him a cup and said, "Stay." He looked at her. "I already said I would." "No, I mean, stay, not in the barn, here, with me." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he set down his cup and took her hand. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I'm sure. Eliza, if we do this, if we really do this, I need you to know something." "What?" "I'm not perfect. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to disappoint you sometimes. I can't promise I won't." "I know. And I need you to promise me something too." "What?" "Don't give up on this. On us. Even when it's hard. Even when you're scared." He squeezed her hand. "Promise me you'll try." Eliza felt tears sting her eyes, the first tears she'd allowed herself in years. "I promise." And she meant it. The weeks that followed were not easy. Caleb's ribs took time to heal, and the farm still demanded constant work. But they worked together now, side by side, building something neither of them had thought possible. They replanted the damaged wheat. They expanded the garden. Caleb dug a new irrigation channel, working through the pain, refusing to quit. Eliza learned to let him help without feeling like she was losing control. They argued sometimes, about small things, about the best way to fix a fence or where to plant the onions, but the arguments never lasted. They were both too tired to hold grudges and too grateful to waste time on pride. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked. Not about the future. They were both still too wary for that, but about the present. About what they'd done that day. About what they'd do tomorrow. Small, practical things that slowly added up to something bigger. One night, as they sat together in the quiet, Caleb said, "I love you." Eliza's breath caught. She looked at him, searching his face. "You don't have to say it back," he said quickly. I needed you to know." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't know if I remember how to love someone. I don't know if I'm any good at it." "That's all right," Caleb said. "We'll figure it out together." And somehow, that was enough. Winter came hard that year, but they were ready for it. The wheat had survived the storm, and the harvest, though small, was enough to sell for supplies. Caleb had reinforced the house, sealed the cracks, and stockpiled firewood. They had food stored, animals sheltered, and each other. On a quiet night in late December, as snow fell outside and the fire crackled in the stove, Eliza finally said the words she'd been holding back. "I love you too." Caleb looked up from the chair he was repairing, surprise flickering across his face. Then he smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. "Say that again." "I love you, Shem," she said, and this time it came easier. "I love you, Caleb Ward." He set down his tools and crossed the room to her. He pulled her into his arms, and she let herself be held, something she never thought she'd allow again. "We're going to make it," he said quietly. "Yeah," she whispered. "I think we are." And for the first time in years, Eliza Thornfield believed in something beyond survival. She believed in tomorrow. The marriage happened fast, too fast, by most people's standards. But Eliza and Caleb weren't most people, and they'd already wasted enough time being careful. It was early January when Caleb brought it up. They were in the barn, feeding the horses. The air so cold their breath came out in clouds. He'd been quiet all morning, which wasn't unusual, but there was something different in the way he kept glancing at her, like he was working up to something. "What?" she finally asked, scattering hay for the chickens. "I've been thinking," he said. "About?" He set down the bucket he was holding and turned to face her. "About us. About what we're doing here." Eliza's stomach tightened. She'd learned to recognize that tone. Serious, careful, like he was about to say something that mattered. "All right. We've been living together for almost 2 months now," he said. "And I know we said we'd take it slow, figure things out as we went. But the thing is," he paused, running a hand through his hair, "I don't want to figure it out anymore. I already know." "Know what?" That I want to marry you. The words hung in the cold air between them. Eliza felt her heart skip, then pound harder. She'd thought about this, of course. Late at night, when she couldn't sleep, when Caleb was beside her and she could hear him breathing. But thinking about it and hearing him say it out loud were two different things. Why? She asked. Caleb blinked. What do you mean, why? I mean exactly that. Why do you want to marry me? We're already living together. We're already working the farm together. What would marriage change? He was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he said, It would make it real. Not just between us, but to everyone else. It would mean you're not alone anymore, not in the eyes of the law or the town or anyone who might try to take advantage of that. And it would mean I'm not just some drifter who showed up and stuck around. It would mean I'm yours, and you're mine, and that's not going to change. Eliza looked down at her hands. They were rough, calloused, scarred from years of work. Not the hands of a woman who'd ever expected to hear a proposal. People will talk, she said quietly. Let them. They'll say I'm desperate, that I took the first man who showed up because I couldn't make it on my own. Are you? She met his eyes. No. Then it doesn't matter what they say. He stepped closer. Eliza, I'm not asking you to marry me because I think you need saving. I'm asking because I want to build a life with you, a real one, and I want to do it the right way. She felt her throat tighten. There's no right way. Not for people like us. Then we'll make our own way. He reached out and took her hand. Marry me. Not because you have to. Not because it's practical. But because you want to. Eliza looked at him, really looked at him. At the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the quiet strength in the way he stood. He wasn't perfect. He snored. He left his tools scattered around. He got stubborn about stupid things, like the right way to stack firewood. But he was honest. He was steady. And he'd proven, over and over, that he meant what he said. All right, she said. Caleb's eyes widened. All right? Yes, I'll marry you. A slow smile spread across his face, the kind that made him look younger, less worn down. Yeah? Don't make me say it again. He laughed and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off the ground. She let out a startled sound, half protest, half laugh, and for a moment they were just two people standing in a freezing barn, holding on to each other like they'd found something they'd given up looking for. When he set her down, she said, We should do it soon, before the weather gets worse. How soon? Next week? He raised an eyebrow. That's fast. You were the one who said you didn't want to wait. Fair point. He kissed her forehead. Next week it is. They rode into town the following day to make the arrangements. The minister, a thin man named Reverend Colfax, looked them over with thinly veiled disapproval when they explained what they wanted. You understand marriage is a sacred commitment, he said, his voice dry and reedy, not something to be entered into lightly. We understand, Caleb said evenly. And you've known each other for how long? Long enough, Eliza said. Reverend Colfax frowned. Mrs. Thornfield, I knew your late husband. Thomas was a good man. I hope you're not acting out of desperation. Eliza felt her jaw tighten. She'd expected this. The judgment, the assumptions. But that didn't make it any easier to stomach. With all due respect, Reverend, my reasons are my own. I'm simply concerned for your welfare. I'm concerned for my welfare too, she interrupted, which is why I'm marrying a man I trust instead of waiting around for someone else to decide what's best for me. The Reverend's frown deepened, but he didn't argue further. He agreed to perform the ceremony the following Saturday, though his tone suggested he thought they'd regret it. As they left the church, Caleb said, You didn't have to be so hard on him. Yes, I did, Eliza said. Men like that think a woman can't make a decision without a man's approval. I'm tired of it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Good. She glanced at him. Good? Yeah, I'd rather marry a woman who speaks her mind than one who doesn't. He took her hand. Even if it means she'll call me out when I'm being an idiot. Despite herself, Eliza smiled. That's going to happen a lot. I'm counting on it. Word spread fast. By the time they got back to the farm, Naomi was already riding up the path, her face a mixture of shock and vindication. "You're getting married?" she called out before she'd even dismounted. "News travels," Eliza said dryly. Naomi swung down from her horse, grinning. "I knew it. I knew you two would work out. You didn't know anything. You just meddled. Call it what you want. I'm taking credit." Naomi looked at Caleb, who was unloading supplies from the wagon. "You treating her right?" "I'm trying," Caleb said. "Good, because if you don't, you'll answer to me." But she was smiling when she said it. She turned back to Eliza. "So when's the wedding?" "Saturday." Naomi's smile faltered. "This Saturday? As in 6 days from now?" "That's the one." "Eliza, that's barely enough time to plan anything. What about a dress? What about food? What about—" "I don't need any of that," Eliza said. "I just need a witness and a minister. Everything else is extra." Naomi looked at her for a long moment, then shook her head. "You're the stubbornest woman I've ever met." "I know." "Fine, but at least let me bring a cake and some flowers. You're not getting married in that barn without something to make it feel like a wedding." Eliza wanted to argue, but the look on Naomi's face stopped her. This mattered to her friend, even if it didn't matter to Eliza. So she nodded. "All right, cake and flowers." Naomi beamed. "I'll make it nice. You'll see." The days leading up to the wedding were a blur of work and preparation. Caleb insisted on cleaning up the house, even though Eliza told him it was pointless. He scrubbed the floors, fixed the door that had been sticking, and even patched a hole in the roof she hadn't noticed. She watched him work with a mixture of amusement and affection, realizing that this was his way of showing he cared, not through grand gestures, but through the steady, quiet work of making things better. On Friday night, the night before the wedding, they sat together by the fire. The house was as ready as it was going to be. The barn was clean, the animals were fed. There was nothing left to do but wait. "You nervous?" Caleb asked. Eliza thought about it. "No. Are you?" "A little." She glanced at him, surprised. "Why?" He shrugged. "I keep thinking about all the ways I could mess this up, all the ways I could let you down." "You won't." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." She reached over and took his hand. "Because you're not the kind of man who runs when things get hard. You're the kind who stays and fixes them. I've seen it." Caleb looked at their joined hands, then back at her. "What if staying isn't enough?" "It will be," she said quietly. "For me, it already is." He squeezed her hand, and they sat there in the firelight, two people who'd spent most of their lives alone, trying to believe they didn't have to be anymore. The wedding was small. Reverend Colfax performed the ceremony in the barn. Eliza had refused to do it in the church, saying she didn't want to pretend this was something it wasn't. Naomi was there, along with her husband, and a few neighbors who'd heard about it and shown up out of curiosity. Eliza wore the same dress she always wore, dark and practical, but Naomi had brought a small bouquet of dried wildflowers, and Caleb had cleaned up his best shirt. The ceremony itself was brief. Reverend Colfax read the vows in his dry, formal voice, and Eliza and Caleb repeated them, their words steady and sure. When it came time to exchange rings, Caleb pulled out 2 simple bands he'd bought in town. Nothing fancy, just plain metal, but they fit. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Colfax said, sounding like he was announcing a funeral. "You may kiss the bride." Caleb looked at Eliza, a question in his eyes. She nodded, and he leaned in and kissed her, gentle, brief, but real. When they pulled apart, Naomi was crying, and even her husband looked a little misty-eyed. "Congratulations," Naomi said, hugging Eliza tightly. "I'm so happy for you." "Thank you," Eliza said, and she meant it. The small gathering moved to the house, where Naomi had set up a simple meal and the promised cake. It wasn't much, but it felt like enough. People ate and talked, and for a little while Eliza let herself relax into it. The normalcy, the warmth, the strange feeling of being part of something bigger than just survival. At one point, Caleb pulled her aside. "You doing all right?" "Yeah, Issei," she said. "I think I am." "No regrets?" She looked at him, her husband now, strange as that sounded, and shook her head. No regrets. By evening, Everyone had gone home, and Eliza and Caleb were alone again. They sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the frozen fields, wrapped in blankets against the cold. "So this is it," Caleb said. "This is it. We're married. We are." He smiled. "Feels the same as yesterday." "Does it?" He thought about it. "No, not really. It feels bigger, like something's changed even though nothing has." Eliza knew what he meant. The farm was the same. The work was the same. But the weight of it felt different now, lighter somehow, because it wasn't just hers anymore. It was theirs. "Come on," she said, standing up. "It's freezing out here." They went inside, and for the first time it felt like coming home. The winter months were hard, but they were manageable. Caleb had stockpiled enough firewood to last, and the wheat harvest had brought in just enough money to buy supplies. They settled into a routine, feeding the animals, repairing what broke, planning for spring. And at night, they sat by the fire and talked about the future in a way Eliza never had before. Not in vague terms, but in concrete ones. What they'd plant, where they'd build, how they'd make it work. One night in late February, as the blizzard raged outside, Caleb said, "I've been thinking about the garden." Eliza looked up from the sock she was darning. "What about it?" "We should expand it, plant more than we need so we can sell the surplus in town. Vegetables, maybe some herbs. People will pay for fresh produce, especially in summer." "That's a lot of work." "I know, but it's work that'll pay off." He hesitated. "I was also thinking, maybe we could get a few more chickens. Start selling eggs." Eliza set down the sock. "You're talking about turning this place into a real farm. Isn't that what it already is?" "No. Right now it's just survival. What you're talking about is growth." Caleb leaned forward. "Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. We've spent all winter just trying to get by. But spring's coming, and we've got a chance to do more than that. We've got a chance to build something that lasts." Eliza felt something stir in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly, but close to it. The belief that maybe, just maybe, they could do more than just survive. Maybe they could thrive. "All right, she said. "Let's do it." Caleb grinned. "Yeah?" "Yeah." He reached across the table and took her hand. "We're going to make this work, Eliza. I know we are." And for the first time, she believed him. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, the way it always did on the plains. The snow melted in patches, leaving behind mud and dead grass. But underneath, the land was waking up. The wheat they'd planted in the fall started to sprout. Thin green shoots pushing through the soil, fragile but determined. Caleb started on the garden immediately. He spent days turning the soil, mixing in manure from the barn, building raised beds to protect the plants from late frosts. Eliza worked beside him, her hands in the dirt, feeling the ache in her back and shoulders but pushing through it. This was different from the work she'd done alone. This felt like progress. They planted vegetables, carrots, onions, beans, squash, tomatoes. Caleb built trellises for the climbing plants and a simple irrigation system that pulled water from the creek. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. And as the weeks went on and the plants started to grow, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not in herself necessarily, but in what they were building together. The garden was tangible proof that they could do this, that they could take something broken and make it whole. One afternoon in late April, Naomi rode over to see how they were doing. She stood at the edge of the garden, hands on her hips, looking impressed. "Well," she said, "I'll be damned." "What?" Eliza asked, wiping sweat from her forehead. "You've actually done it. You've turned this place around. It's still a work in progress. It's a hell of a lot better than it was 6 months ago." Naomi glanced at Caleb, who was repairing a fence nearby. "He's good for you." Eliza followed her gaze. "Yeah, he is." "You happy?" It was a simple question, but it caught Eliza off guard. She thought about it, really thought about it. Was she happy? She wasn't sure she knew what that felt like anymore. But she felt steady, grounded, like she had a reason to get up in the morning that went beyond just surviving. "I think so," she said finally. Naomi smiled. "Good. You deserve it." But not everything was smooth. There were setbacks, storms that tore through the garden, animals that got sick, tools that broke at the worst possible times. And there were moments when Eliza's old fears crept back in, whispering that this was all temporary, that Caleb would leave, that she'd end up alone again. One night, after a particularly hard day, she snapped at him over something stupid, the way he'd stacked the firewood, or the fact that he'd forgotten to latch the chicken coop. She couldn't even remember what it was, but she'd lashed out, her voice sharp and cutting, and he'd just stood there, taking it. When she finally ran out of steam, he said quietly, "What's really going on, Eliza?" "Nothing." "That's not true." She turned away, her throat tight. "I don't know. Sometimes I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something to go wrong, for you to realize this was a mistake." Caleb crossed the room and turned her to face him. "This isn't a mistake. You don't know that." "Yes, I do, because I wake up every morning and choose to be here, and I'll keep choosing it, no matter how many times you push me away." He cupped her face in his hands. "I'm not going anywhere, Eliza. You need to start believing that." She wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He meant it. He really meant it. And slowly, painfully, she let herself believe him. By early summer, the garden was thriving. They harvested the first crop of lettuce and radishes and took them into town to sell. People were skeptical at first. Why buy from Eliza Thornfield when they could grow their own? But the produce was good, fresh, and cheap enough to be worth it. Word spread, and soon they had regular customers. The money wasn't much, but it was enough to buy seed for the next planting, and a few chickens, and some lumber to repair the barn. Slowly, bit by bit, the farm started to feel less like a burden and more like a business. Caleb also started taking carpentry jobs in town. People needed things built or repaired, and he had the skills. He'd leave early in the morning, work all day, and come home at dusk, exhausted but satisfied. Eliza hated seeing him work so hard, but she also understood it. This was how they were going to make it, not through luck or charity, but through sheer, stubborn effort. One evening, as they sat on the porch after a long day, Caleb said, "I've been thinking about building something." "What kind of something?" "A greenhouse, small, just big enough to grow seedlings in winter. That way we can get a head start on spring planting, maybe even grow some greens year-round." Eliza looked at him. "That's ambitious." "I know, but I think we can do it. I've got enough scrap lumber from the jobs I've been doing, and I can build the frame myself. We just need glass, and I can probably trade for that." She thought about it. A greenhouse would be a risk, another project, another thing that could fail. But it would also be an investment, a way to expand what they were doing, to make the farm more sustainable. "All right," she said, "let's do it." Caleb started on the greenhouse in late June. He worked on it in the evenings and on Sundays, piecing it together slowly and carefully. Eliza helped when she could, holding boards steady, passing him tools, learning as she went. It wasn't fast work, but it was good work, and watching it take shape gave her a sense of satisfaction she hadn't expected. By mid-July, the structure was up, a small, sturdy building with a slanted roof, positioned on the south side of the house to catch the most sunlight. Caleb fitted the glass carefully, sealing the gaps with pitch to keep the cold out. When it was finished, they stood back and looked at it together. "It's not perfect," Caleb said. "It's perfect enough," Eliza said. That night, they celebrated with a bottle of whiskey Naomi had brought over as a wedding gift. They sat on the porch, passing the bottle back and forth, watching the stars come out. "You know what I realized today?" Caleb said. "What?" "I'm happy." He said it simply, like it was a fact. "I didn't think I'd ever feel that way again. But I do." Eliza looked at him, this man who'd shown up out of nowhere and changed everything. "Me too," she said quietly. He smiled and reached for her hand. They sat there in the dark, holding on to each other, two people who'd been broken and were slowly learning how to be whole. August brought the wheat harvest. The crop wasn't huge, but it was better than the year before, and that felt like a victory. Caleb hired a few men from town to help with the threshing, and they worked from dawn to dusk, bundling the stalks and separating the grain. Eliza worked alongside them, her muscles aching, her hands blistered, but her heart full. When it was done, they had enough wheat to sell and enough to keep for seed. It wasn't wealth, but it was security. It was proof that they were moving forward. That night, exhausted and filthy, they collapsed into bed. Caleb was asleep almost instantly, but Eliza lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had changed in the past year. She thought about the woman she'd been, alone, angry, convinced that love was just another word for loss. And she thought about who she was now, still cautious, still scarred, but no longer alone. She rolled over and looked at Caleb, his face peaceful in sleep. She reached out and touched his cheek, feeling the rough stubble under her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, even though he couldn't hear her. The rest of the summer passed in a blur of work and growth. The garden produced more than they could sell, so Eliza started preserving, pickling cucumbers, canning tomatoes, drying beans. The root cellar they dug filled up with jars and sacks, a tangible reminder that they wouldn't go hungry this winter. In September, Caleb finished a big job in town, building a new storefront for the general store. The pay was good, enough to buy supplies for winter and a little extra. He came home that night with a package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Eliza asked. "Open it." She unwrapped it carefully and found a bolt of fabric, soft, dark blue, the nicest cloth she'd seen in years. "What's this for?" she asked, confused. "For you. I thought maybe you could make yourself a new dress, or curtains, or whatever you want." Eliza stared at the fabric, then at him. "Caleb, this must have cost—" "I wanted to get you something," he said. "You've been working so hard, and I wanted you to have something nice." She felt tears prick her eyes. It was such a small thing, but it meant everything, because it meant he saw her. He saw how hard she worked, how much she sacrificed, and he wanted to give something back. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. He pulled her into his arms. "You don't have to thank me. You're my wife. I'm supposed to take care of you." "We take care of each other," she said. "Yeah," he said, smiling. "We do." By October, the farm had settled into a rhythm. The wheat was sold, the garden was harvested, the animals were healthy. They had money saved, food stored, and a plan for the future. For the first time since Thomas had died, Eliza felt like she was on solid ground. But life, she was learning, didn't let you stay comfortable for long. It started with a letter. Caleb had gone into town to pick up supplies, and when he came back, his face was tight, his jaw set. He handed Eliza an envelope without a word. She opened it and read the contents, her stomach sinking with every line. It was from a lawyer in Missouri. Caleb's former employer, the man he'd worked for before coming west, had died. And in his will, he'd left Caleb a sum of money, not a fortune, but enough to make a difference. Enough to buy land or start a business or do whatever he wanted. Eliza looked up at Caleb. This is a lot of money. I know. What are you going to do with it?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know." And for the first time since he'd arrived, Eliza felt the old fear creep back in. Because money meant options, and options meant choices, and choices meant he didn't have to stay here anymore if he didn't want to. She set the letter down carefully. "You could go back to Missouri." "What?" "With that money, you could start over. Buy your own place. Build your own business. You don't have to stay here, Caleb. You don't owe me anything." He stared at her like she'd slapped him. "Is that what you think? That I'm here out of obligation?" "I don't know what to think." "Eliza, I'm not leaving. I'm not going anywhere. But you could?" "I don't want to." He crossed the room and took her by the shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "I don't want Missouri. I don't want to start over somewhere else. I want to be here. With you. On this farm. Building this life. That's what I want. But no buts. This is my choice, and I'm choosing you." Eliza felt her defenses crack, the fear and doubt spilling out. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know, so am I. But we're going to be okay." He pulled her close. "We're going to take that money, and we're going to use it to make this place everything it can be. We're going to buy more land, build a better barn, dig a real well. We're going to do it together." She clung to him, letting herself believe it, letting herself hope. "Okay, she said finally. Okay. And just like that, the future opened up in front of them, bigger, brighter, and more terrifying than anything Eliza had ever imagined. But this time, she wasn't facing it alone. They started planning the next morning. Caleb spread out a piece of paper on the kitchen table, sketching rough drawings of what the farm could become. Eliza stood beside him, watching his hand move across the page, seeing the future take shape in pencil lines and measurements. First thing we need is water, he said, tapping the paper. A proper well, deep enough that it won't run dry in summer. That'll cost the most, but it's the foundation for everything else. How much? Maybe a third of the money? But once we have it, we can irrigate properly. Expand the garden, maybe add an orchard. Fruit trees take years to mature, but they're worth it in the long run. Eliza studied the sketch. It was ambitious, more ambitious than anything she'd allowed herself to dream about. What about the barn? We'll need to expand it if we're getting more animals. I'm thinking cattle, maybe a dairy cow. We could sell milk and butter in town. He looked up at her. What do you think? What did she think? She thought it was terrifying. She thought it was exactly the kind of hope that could destroy you if it didn't work out. But she also thought about the past year, how every risk they'd taken had paid off, how every piece of progress had built on the last. I think we should do it, she said. But we do it smart. One thing at a time. We don't spend everything at once. Caleb nodded. Agreed. We'll start with the well. Once that's done, we'll see where we stand. The well digger came out in late October. His name was Frank Hutchins, a grizzled man in his 50s who'd been digging wells across the territory for 20 years. He walked the property with Caleb, studying the land, the slope, the vegetation, looking for signs of water below. Here, he said finally, marking a spot about 50 yards from the house. This is where you'll hit water. Can't promise how deep, but my guess is 30, maybe 40 feet. How long will it take, Caleb asked. Week, maybe 2, depends on the rock. And the cost? Frank quoted a price that made Eliza wince, but Caleb just nodded. When can you start? Tomorrow, if you want. Tomorrow it is. Frank and his crew showed up the next morning with their equipment, picks, shovels, pulleys, timber for shoring up the walls. They worked methodically, digging down through layers of soil and clay, hauling up buckets of dirt and rock. Eliza and Caleb watched from a distance, listening to the rhythmic sound of metal striking earth. You nervous? Eliza asked. Little bit, Caleb admitted. What if he doesn't find water? Then we figure something else out. He glanced at her. You're getting better at this hope thing. Don't push it. But she was nervous too. This was a gamble, spending that much money on something that might not work. If the well came up dry, they'd have wasted resources they couldn't afford to lose. But if it worked, everything changed. After 5 days, Frank hit water. Eliza was in the garden when she heard the shout. She looked up to see Frank's crew gathered around the hole, pulling up a bucket that sloshed with clear, cold water. Caleb was running toward them, and Eliza dropped her tools and followed. We got it, Frank called out, grinning. 32 feet, strong flow. You've got yourself a good well here. Caleb let out a breath Eliza hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned to her, his face splitting into a wide smile. We did it. You did it, she said. No, we did. He pulled her into a hug, lifting her off the ground, and she laughed despite herself, a real laugh, the kind that came from relief and joy and the strange, overwhelming feeling of something going right. Frank and his crew finished the well over the next few days, installing a pump and building a stone casing to keep it clean. When it was done, Caleb tested it himself, working the handle until water gushed out into a bucket. It was cold and clean and tasted like nothing, just pure, simple water. That night they stood by the well in the dark, listening to the wind and the distant sounds of the prairie. This changes everything, Eliza said quietly. Yeah, Caleb agreed. It does. With the well in place, they started planning the next phase. Caleb wanted to expand the barn first, but Eliza convinced him to focus on the irrigation system. They needed to make sure the garden could support itself before they added more animals. It took some arguing. Caleb was stubborn when he had an idea in his head, but eventually he agreed. They spent the next 2 weeks digging trenches from the well to the garden, laying pipes Caleb had ordered from town. It was back-breaking work, and Eliza's hands blistered even through her gloves. But when they finally turned on the water and watched it flow into the garden beds, soaking the soil, she felt a surge of satisfaction that made every ache worth it. "We're going to have the best vegetables in the county," Caleb said, watching the water spread. "Don't get ahead of yourself." "I'm not. I'm just stating facts." Eliza shook her head, but she was smiling. He had a way of making her believe in things she'd never thought possible. By mid-November, the first snow fell. It came early that year, catching everyone off guard. Eliza woke one morning to find the world covered in white, the fields transformed into a blank expanse that stretched to the horizon. She stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the snow fall in thick, quiet flakes. Caleb came up behind her, slipping his arms around her waist. "Beautiful, isn't it? It's cold. That too." He rested his chin on her shoulder. "You ready for another winter?" More ready than last year. And she was. The root cellar was full. The barn was stocked with hay. They had firewood stacked to the roof and enough supplies to last until spring. For the first time in years, Eliza wasn't afraid of winter. She was ready for it. But winter on the plains was never predictable. The first real storm hit in early December. It came fast and brutal, a blizzard that roared out of the north and buried everything in snow. Eliza and Caleb spent 3 days inside, unable to even reach the barn. They took turns keeping the fire going, rationing their food, listening to the wind howl outside. On the third day, the storm finally broke. Caleb bundled up and went out to check on the animals. Eliza watched from the window, her heart in her throat, until she saw him emerge from the barn and wave. Everything was fine. The animals had survived, but the snow was deep, deeper than she'd ever seen it. It took them days to dig out paths between the house and the barn, between the barn and the well. Every step was an effort, every task twice as hard as it should have been. And just when they thought they were getting ahead, another storm would roll in and bury everything again. One night, as they huddled by the fire, Caleb said, "I've been thinking." "About?" "About next winter. We need better shelter for the animals, a bigger barn, insulated properly, and maybe a covered walkway between the house and the barn, so we don't have to fight through the snow every time." Eliza looked at him. "You're always thinking ahead, aren't you? Someone has to." "I know, but sometimes I wonder if you ever just stop and enjoy what we've got right now." Caleb was quiet for a moment, then he set down the stick he'd been whittling and turned to face her. "You're right. I do think too much about the future, but that's because I want to make sure we have one. I want to make sure we don't just survive, we thrive. We are thriving. Are we? Look around, Caleb. We've got food. We've got shelter. We've got each other. That's more than most people have." He reached for her hand. "I know, and I'm grateful for it, but I also know how fast things can go wrong. I've lived through it, and I just want to be ready." Eliza squeezed his hand. "I get it, but don't forget to live in the present too, because if we're always worrying about what might go wrong, we'll miss what's going right." Caleb smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You just didn't notice." He laughed and pulled her close. They sat like that for a long time, the fire crackling beside them, the snow falling outside, two people learning how to balance fear and hope. Winter dragged on. January was brutal, with temperatures that dropped so low the water in the pump froze solid. Caleb had to heat rocks in the fire and wrap them in cloth to thaw the pipes, a process that took hours. February brought more snow, more storms, more long nights when the wind screamed and the house shook. But they made it through. And when March finally arrived, bringing the first hints of warmth, Eliza felt like she'd survived a battle. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, the snow melting in patches to reveal the muddy ground beneath. Caleb started working on the barn expansion as soon as the weather allowed. He'd hired 2 men from town to help, and they worked from dawn to dusk, framing walls, raising beams, hammering shingles into place. Eliza watched them work, marveling at how quickly the structure took shape. Within 2 weeks, the new section was finished, a clean, solid addition that doubled the barn's size. Caleb had even built stalls for cattle, anticipating the day they'd be able to afford a herd. "You're getting ahead of yourself again?" Eliza said, standing in the new space. "Maybe, but it doesn't hurt to be prepared." Famous last words. But she was impressed. The barn looked professional, sturdy, built to last. It was a far cry from the sagging wreck it had been when Caleb first arrived. With the barn done, they turned their attention to planting. The garden was twice the size it had been the year before, and with the irrigation system in place, they could plant more variety: potatoes, cabbage, peas, herbs. Caleb also convinced Eliza to try something new: strawberries. "Strawberries?" she said skeptically. "In Dakota? Why not? I've seen them grow in worse places. They're finicky. They need constant care. So we'll take care of them." Eliza sighed, but she helped him plant the runners anyway. She didn't have high hopes, but Caleb was so enthusiastic about it that she didn't have the heart to say no. By late April, the garden was in full swing. The vegetables were sprouting, the wheat fields were green, and the strawberries, against all odds, were starting to flower. Eliza checked on them every day, half expecting them to wither and die, but they kept growing. "See?" Caleb said one evening, crouching beside the strawberry patch. "I told you they'd work. They haven't produced fruit yet. They will." And they did. By early June, the strawberry plants were heavy with small, bright red berries. Eliza picked the first handful and brought them inside, washing them carefully before handing one to Caleb. He bit into it, and his face lit up. "That's good. That's really good." Eliza tried one herself. It was sweet, tart, perfect. "We could sell these." That's what I was thinking. They brought the first batch to town the following week. People were skeptical at first. Strawberries were a luxury, not something you saw on the frontier. But once they tasted them, they sold out within an hour. Eliza and Caleb went home with more money than they'd expected, and orders for the next harvest. "I can't believe that worked," Eliza said as they rode back to the farm. "I can," Caleb said. "You just have to be willing to try things. You're insufferable when you're right." "I know." But she was smiling. The summer was busy. Between the garden, the strawberries, and Caleb's carpentry jobs, they barely had time to breathe. But it was good work, satisfying work, and every week they made progress. The farm was thriving in a way Eliza had never imagined possible. In July, Naomi came by with news. "John Miller's selling his cattle," she said. "His wife's sick and they're moving back east to be near her family. He's got a good herd, 10 cows, a bull, all healthy. He's selling cheap because he needs to move them fast." Eliza and Caleb exchanged a look. "How cheap?" Caleb asked. Naomi named a price that was well within their budget. "We should do it," Caleb said. Eliza hesitated. Cattle were a big commitment. More mouths to feed, more work, more risk. But they also represented stability. Milk, butter, cheese, eventually calves they could sell. It was the next logical step. "All right," she said. "Let's do it." They bought the herd the following week. John Miller delivered them personally, helping Caleb get them settled in the barn. The cows were docile, used to being handled, and the bull was young but strong. It was a good purchase. That night, as they stood in the barn watching the cattle settle in, Caleb said, "This is really happening, isn't it?" "What?" "This, the farm. Everything we've been working toward. It's actually working." Eliza leaned against him. "Yeah, it is. You ever think about what comes next?" "Like what?" He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Like a family." Eliza felt her breath catch. They'd never talked about this. Not directly. She'd assumed it was off the table, given everything they'd both been through. But now, standing in the barn with the smell of hay and the sound of cattle shifting in their stalls, the idea didn't seem so impossible. "You want kids?" she asked carefully. "I don't know. Maybe. Do you?" She thought about it. The truth was, she'd never allowed herself to want children. After Thomas died, after David left, the idea of bringing a child into her broken, struggling world had seemed cruel. But things were different now. The farm was stable. She had a partner. She had hope. "I think I might," she said quietly. Caleb turned to look at her. his eyes searching hers. Yeah? Yeah. He smiled, slow, warm, genuine. Then maybe we'll get there? When we're ready. When we're ready, she agreed. But fate, as Eliza had learned, didn't wait for you to be ready. She realized she was pregnant in early August. At first, she thought she was just tired. Too many long days in the garden. Too much work in the heat. But when the exhaustion didn't fade, when she started feeling nauseous in the mornings, she began to suspect. She rode into town and saw the doctor, a stern woman named Dr. Margaret Hayes, who confirmed what Eliza already knew. You're about 6 weeks along, Dr. Hayes said. Everything looks normal, but you'll need to take it easy. No heavy lifting, no overworking yourself. Eliza almost laughed. Taking it easy wasn't an option on a farm. But she thanked the doctor and rode home, her mind spinning. She didn't know how to feel. Part of her was terrified. What if something went wrong? What if she lost the baby the way Caleb had lost his child? What if she wasn't ready, wasn't good enough? But another part of her, a part she hadn't expected, felt something close to joy. When she got home, Caleb was in the barn, milking the cows. She stood in the doorway, watching him work, trying to figure out how to tell him. He looked up and saw her. Hey, how'd it go in town? Fine. You feeling any better? Not really. She took a breath. Caleb, I need to tell you something. He set down the bucket and stood up, concern flickering across his face. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. At least, I don't think it is. She paused. I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air between them. Caleb stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, and Eliza felt her stomach drop. Maybe he didn't want this. Maybe it was too soon, too much. Then he crossed the barn in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms. You're sure? The doctor confirmed it. He pulled back, holding her at arm's length, his eyes searching hers. How do you feel about it? Scared, she admitted, but also happy, I think. Yeah, he said, his voice thick. Yeah, me too. He kissed her then, deep and desperate, and when they finally pulled apart, she saw tears on his face. I didn't think I'd get another chance at this, he said quietly. Neither did I. They stood there in the barn, holding each other. 2 people who'd been broken, finding a way to be whole. The pregnancy changed everything and nothing. Eliza kept working. She couldn't afford not to. But Caleb took on more of the heavy tasks, insisting she rest whenever she could. She argued with him about it constantly, hating the feeling of being coddled, but he was immovable. You're carrying our child, he said. Let me take care of you. I can take care of myself. I know, but you don't have to anymore. It was hard to argue with that. As the weeks went on, her body changed. Her stomach started to swell. Her energy came and went in unpredictable waves. Some days she felt fine, capable of anything. Other days she could barely get out of bed. It was frustrating, humbling, and terrifying all at once. But through it all, Caleb was there. He brought her water when she felt sick. He rubbed her aching back at night. He talked to her about the future, about names, about where the baby would sleep, about how they'd manage the farm with a child. And slowly, Eliza let herself believe it might actually work. In September, Naomi threw her a small gathering. It wasn't much. Just a few neighbor women, some food, a few small gifts. But it was more than Eliza had expected, and she found herself unexpectedly moved by the gesture. You're going to be a wonderful mother, Naomi said, hugging her. I don't know about that. I do. You're strong. You're smart. And you've got a good man by your side. That baby's lucky to have you. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just promise you'll ask for help when you need it. You don't have to do this alone. I know. And for the first time, she really did know. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Caleb. She had Naomi. She had a community, small as it was, that cared about her. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling, but not an unwelcome one. By October, the farm was preparing for winter again. The harvest was in. The animals were sheltered. The supplies were stocked. Eliza's belly was round now, impossible to hide, and she moved more slowly, more carefully. The baby was due in February, and every day that passed brought them closer. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Caleb rested his hand on her stomach. You think it's a boy or a girl? Does it matter? No, I'm just curious. Eliza put her hand over his. I think it's a girl. Yeah? Yeah. A stubborn, fierce little girl who's going to give us hell. Caleb laughed. Sounds about right. The baby kicked, a strong, insistent movement that made them both go still. Caleb's eyes widened. Was that? That was her. He pressed his hand more firmly against her stomach, waiting. When the baby kicked again, his face broke into the biggest smile Eliza had ever seen. She's strong, he said. She's got good genes. Yeah, he said softly. She does. As winter settled in and the days grew shorter, Eliza found herself thinking more and more about the future. Not with fear, the way she used to, but with something close to anticipation. She thought about the child growing inside her, about the farm they'd built, about the life they'd created together. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. There would be hard seasons, failed crops, storms that destroyed what they'd worked for. There would be arguments and setbacks and moments when she'd wonder if they could keep going. But they would, because they'd already proven they could survive anything as long as they had each other. One night, as snow fell outside and the fire burned low, Caleb said, I love you, Eliza. She looked at him, this man who'd shown up as a stranger and become everything. I love you too. I know we don't say it enough. We don't need to, I know. Still, I wanted you to hear it. He took her hand. You saved my life, you know that? I didn't save anything. You did that yourself. No, I was just surviving before I met you. You taught me how to live again. Eliza felt her throat tighten. You did the same for me. They sat there in the quiet, hands clasped, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, the wind howled and the snow piled up against the windows. But inside, they were warm, they were safe, and they were home. January came with a cold that bit through every layer of clothing. Eliza moved through the house like a ship in heavy seas, her belly enormous now, her movements slow and deliberate. She couldn't do much anymore, couldn't lift the water buckets, couldn't bend to feed the chickens, couldn't even put on her own boots without help. It drove her half crazy, this dependence, but Caleb handled it with patience she didn't think she deserved. I'm useless, she said one morning, watching him haul in firewood while she sat at the table, unable to do anything but peel potatoes. You're growing a human being, he said, stacking the wood by the stove. That's not useless. I should be helping more. You're helping by staying healthy. That's all I need you to do. She wanted to argue, but the baby chose that moment to kick hard against her ribs, stealing her breath. She pressed a hand to her side, wincing. Caleb was beside her in an instant. You all right? She's just reminding me she's there. Still think it's a girl. I know it is. Eliza shifted, trying to find a comfortable position. She's too stubborn to be anything else. Caleb smiled and knelt down, pressing his ear against her belly. Well, little one, take it easy on your mama. She's tougher than she looks, but she's still human. The baby kicked again, as if in response, and Caleb laughed. Eliza looked down at him, this man who talked to their unborn child like she could already hear him, and felt something crack open in her chest. Love? Yes, but also fear, because now there was something to lose that was bigger than just herself. What if something goes wrong? She asked quietly. Caleb looked up at her. Nothing's going to go wrong. You don't know that. No, but I choose to believe it anyway. He stood and took her hand. We've made it this far, haven't we? Through storms and droughts and everything else this land's thrown at us. We'll make it through this too. Eliza wanted to believe him, but at night, when she couldn't sleep because the baby was pressing on her lungs or her back ached too much to get comfortable, the fear crept in. She thought about Caleb's first wife, who died in childbirth. She thought about all the women on the frontier who didn't survive. She thought about how fragile life really was, how quickly everything could fall apart. But she didn't tell Caleb any of this. He had enough to worry about. By the middle of January, Dr. Hayes started making weekly visits. She'd ride out from town, check Eliza's pulse and blood pressure, listen to the baby's heartbeat through a wooden tube, and offer calm, practical advice. Everything looks normal, she said after one examination. Baby's positioned well, heartbeat strong. You're doing fine. When do you think it'll happen? Eliza asked. Hard to say exactly. Could be 2 weeks, could be 4. First babies like to take their time. Dr. Hayes packed up her instruments. Just make sure you send for me the moment the contractions start getting regular. And don't try to be a hero about it. Labor's hard work, and there's no shame in asking for help. After she left, Eliza stood at the window, watching the doctor's buggy disappear down the snow-covered road. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of more snow. Everything felt suspended, waiting. You scared? Caleb asked from behind her. Terrified. Me too. She turned to look at him. You don't have to be scared. You're not the one who has to do this. No, but I have to watch you do it, and that's its own kind of terror. He crossed the room and pulled her close, careful of her belly. I keep thinking about Sarah, about how I couldn't help her, couldn't save her. And I know you're not her, and this isn't the same situation. But you're still scared of losing me. Yeah. Eliza rested her head against his chest. I'm not planning on dying, Caleb. Good, because I'm not planning on letting you. They stood there in the gray light, holding each other, two people trying to be brave for each other's sake. The contractions started on a Tuesday morning in early February. Eliza woke just before dawn with a dull ache in her lower back. At first, she thought it was just the usual discomfort. She'd been sleeping badly for weeks. But then the ache tightened into something sharper, a band of pressure that wrapped around her middle and squeezed. She lay there, breathing through it, waiting to see if it would pass. When it did, she counted the minutes until the next one. 15 minutes. Then another. Then another. Each one a little stronger than the last. Beside her, Caleb was still asleep. She thought about waking him. But what would she say? It might be false labor. It might be nothing. She'd wait a little longer, make sure it was real before she caused a panic. By the time the sun came up, the contractions were 10 minutes apart and strong enough to make her gasp. Caleb woke when she shifted in bed, trying to find a position that didn't hurt. Eliza? I think it's time, she said. He was out of bed in seconds, pulling on his pants, fumbling with his boots. How long have you been having contractions? Couple hours. A couple hours? Why didn't you wake me? I wanted to be sure. He stared at her. You wanted to be sure. Eliza, you're in labor. How much more sure do you need to be? Don't yell at me right now, Caleb. He took a breath, visibly calming himself. You're right. I'm sorry. What do you need? I need you to ride to town and get Dr. Hayes. I'm not leaving you alone. I'll be fine for an hour. Just go. Another contraction hit, harder this time, and Eliza gripped the edge of the mattress, breathing through it. When it passed, Caleb was staring at her with wide, terrified eyes. Go, she said. Now. He grabbed his coat and was out the door before she could say anything else. She heard the barn door slam, heard the horse's hooves pounding away down the road, and then she was alone. For a moment, she let herself feel the fear. This was it. This was really happening. There was no turning back now, no changing her mind. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not. Then another contraction hit, and she didn't have time to be afraid anymore. Caleb made it to town in record time, his horse half lathered by the time he reached Dr. Hayes' house. He pounded on the door until she opened it, already half dressed like she'd been expecting him. It's time? She asked. Yes. Contractions are about 10 minutes apart, maybe less. How's she doing? She's scared, so am I. Dr. Hayes nodded. That's normal. Let me get my bag. I'll follow you back. They rode hard, the cold wind stinging Caleb's face. His mind was racing, running through every worst-case scenario he could imagine. What if they didn't make it in time? What if something went wrong? What if he lost Eliza the same way he'd lost Sarah? He shoved the thoughts down and focused on writing. When they reached the farm, he burst through the door to find Eliza pacing the kitchen, one hand pressed to her lower back. She looked up when he came in, relief flickering across her face. About time, she said, but her voice was strained. Dr. Hayes came in right behind him, setting her bag on the table. All right, Mrs. Ward, let's get you somewhere more comfortable. They helped Eliza to the bedroom. Dr. Hayes examined her, her movements calm and efficient, while Caleb hovered in the doorway, feeling utterly useless. You're doing well. Dr. Hayes said. Baby's in a good position. This is going to take a while, though. First babies usually do. How long? Eliza asked. Could be hours, could be most of the day. There's no rushing these things. Eliza closed her eyes, and Caleb saw the exhaustion already settling in. He crossed the room and took her hand. I'm here, he said. I'm not going anywhere. You might want to reconsider that, Dr. Hayes said dryly. Some men don't handle labor well. I'm staying, Caleb said firmly. And he did. For the next 10 hours, he stayed by Eliza's side, holding her hand through the contractions, bringing her water when she asked for it, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. He watched her suffer through pain he couldn't take away, couldn't fix, and it was the hardest thing he'd ever done. I can't do this, Eliza said at one point, her voice breaking. I can't. Yes, you can, Caleb said. You're the strongest person I know. I'm not strong enough for this. You are. You've survived everything this life has thrown at you. You can survive this too. She looked at him, her eyes wild with pain and fear. What if I die? You're not going to die. You don't know that. Yes, I do, because you're too stubborn to die. You're going to get through this, and we're going to have a daughter, and you're going to be the best mother she could ask for. Eliza let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. You're an idiot. I know. Another contraction hit, and she gripped his hand so hard he thought his bones might break, but he didn't pull away. He just held on and let her hurt him if it helped. By late afternoon, the contractions were coming fast and hard, barely any time to breathe between them. Dr. Hayes checked Eliza again and nodded. It's time to push, she said. Eliza looked terrified. I don't know how. Your body knows. Just listen to it. What followed was the most intense, visceral, terrifying hour of Caleb's life. He'd seen births before, animals mostly, but this was different. This was Eliza, his wife, fighting through pain that made her scream, made her cry, made her curse him and the baby and everything in between. I see the head, Dr. Hayes said. One more push, Eliza. One more. Eliza bore down, her face twisted with effort, and then suddenly there was a sound, a thin, wavering cry that filled the room. It's a girl, Dr. Hayes said, lifting the baby. A healthy baby girl. Caleb felt his knees go weak. He stared at the tiny, squirming creature in Dr. Hayes' hands, unable to believe she was real. She was red and wrinkled and covered in blood, and she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Dr. Hayes cleaned the baby quickly, wrapped her in a blanket, and handed her to Eliza. Here's your daughter. Eliza took the baby with shaking hands, staring down at her like she couldn't quite believe it. The baby had stopped crying and was looking up at her mother with unfocused eyes, her tiny fists waving. Hi, Eliza whispered, her voice breaking. Hi, little one. Caleb sat down on the edge of the bed, unable to stand anymore. He reached out and touched the baby's hand, and her fingers curled around his, gripping tight. She's perfect, he said, his voice thick. Yeah, Eliza said, tears streaming down her face. She is. They named her Sarah, after Caleb's first wife. Eliza had suggested it one night, months ago, saying it felt right to honor the woman who'd come before. Caleb had been hesitant at first, afraid it would hurt too much. But now, looking at his daughter, it felt like a gift. A way of saying that love didn't end, it just transformed. The first few weeks with Sarah were chaos. She cried at all hours, refused to sleep for more than an hour at a time, and demanded constant attention. Eliza was exhausted, her body still recovering from the birth, and Caleb was running on fumes, trying to keep the farm running while also helping with the baby. But despite the exhaustion, despite the sleepless nights and the constant worry, Caleb had never been happier. Watching Eliza cradle their daughter, singing softly to her in the middle of the night, made everything else seem worth it. I'm a terrible mother, Eliza said one night, after Sarah had been crying for an hour straight and nothing seemed to help. You're not, Caleb said, taking the baby from her. You're learning. We both are. She hates me. She doesn't hate you. She's just vocal. Eliza let out a tired laugh. That's one word for it. Caleb walked around the room, bouncing Sarah gently, and after a few minutes, she finally quieted down. He looked at Eliza, who was sprawled on the bed, looking like she might fall asleep standing up. "Go to sleep," he said. "I've got her." "You need sleep too." "I'll sleep when she does. Go." Eliza was too tired to argue. She lay down and was asleep within minutes. Caleb kept walking, Sarah in his arms, watching her tiny face scrunch up and relax as she drifted off. He thought about his first daughter, the one who'd never drawn breath, and he felt a pang of grief mixed with gratitude. He'd lost one family, but he'd been given another chance. And this time, he wasn't going to waste it. By March, they'd fallen into something resembling a routine. Sarah was still demanding, still kept them up at night, but she was also starting to smile, to make little cooing sounds, to recognize their faces. Caleb would make funny faces at her while Eliza nursed, and Sarah would stare at him like he was the most fascinating thing in the world. "She's going to be spoiled," Eliza said, watching them. "Good. She deserves to be spoiled. She deserves to know how to work too. Can't have her growing up soft," Caleb laughed. "With you as her mother, no chance of that." Spring arrived slowly, the snow melting to reveal the muddy ground beneath. Caleb started preparing the fields for planting, and Eliza, still recovering but determined to be useful, worked on smaller tasks, mending clothes, organizing supplies, planning the garden. Sarah spent most of her time in a basket by the window, watching the world with wide, curious eyes. One afternoon, Naomi came by with a gift, a small wooden cradle Caleb had built for her years ago, when her own children were babies. "I don't need it anymore," she said, setting it down in the bedroom. "And Sarah deserves something nicer than a basket." Eliza ran her hand over the smooth wood, touched. "This is beautiful. Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just promise you'll bring that baby by more often. I'm not getting any younger, and I like having little ones around." That night, they moved Sarah into the cradle. She looked so small in it, so fragile, and Eliza felt a surge of protectiveness so strong it almost hurt. "We're going to keep her safe," Caleb said, reading her thoughts. "Whatever it takes." "I know," Eliza said. "I just wish the world was kinder. It's not, but we'll teach her how to be strong anyway." By April, the farm was coming back to life. The fields were planted, the garden was sprouting, and the cattle were healthy and thriving. Caleb had taken on a few carpentry jobs in town, and Eliza was slowly getting back to her old self, her strength returning day by day. Sarah was growing too, filling out, becoming more alert and responsive. She'd started laughing, a bright bubbling sound that made even the hardest days feel lighter. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah in Eliza's arms, Caleb said, "Do you ever think about having more?" Eliza looked at him. "More children?" "Yeah." She thought about it. The birth had been hard, harder than she'd expected, and the recovery had been slow. But looking at Sarah, at the way she smiled up at her with absolute trust, Eliza found she could imagine doing it again. "Maybe," she said, "someday, when I'm ready." "No rush, Caleb said. "I just wanted to know if you were open to it." "I'm open to a lot of things I never thought I'd be open to," Eliza said. "You've changed me." "You've changed me too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn pink and gold. Sarah dozed off in Eliza's arms, her tiny hand curled around her mother's finger. "I never thought I'd have this," Eliza said quietly. "A family. A home that feels like it's really mine. I spent so long just surviving, I forgot what it felt like to actually live. And now? Now I'm living." She looked at him. "Because of you." Caleb leaned over and kissed her forehead. "We're living because of each other." Summer came fast and hot. The garden exploded with growth, the wheat turned golden, and the strawberries produced their second year of fruit. They were busier than ever, but it was good busy, productive busy. They hired a couple of boys from town to help with the harvest, and for the first time, Eliza felt like they weren't just scraping by. They were actually succeeding. Sarah was 6 months old now, sitting up on her own, babbling constantly, reaching for everything. Eliza would bring her out to the garden and let her sit in the shade while she worked, talking to her about the plants, the weather, the world. "You're going to grow up strong," Eliza told her one afternoon, pulling weeds. You're going to know how to work hard, how to stand up for yourself, how to survive anything. But you're also going to know you're loved. That's something I didn't have, but you will." Sarah gurgled in response, waving a blade of grass she'd picked up. "That's right," Eliza said, smiling. "You tell them." One night in late July, after Sarah was asleep and the chores were done, Eliza and Caleb sat on the porch with a bottle of whiskey they'd been saving. The air was warm, the sky full of stars, the cicadas singing in the grass. "You know what I was thinking about today?" Caleb said. "What?" "That day I showed up here. How scared I was. How sure I was that you'd send me away." "I almost did." "I know. I could tell." He took a sip of whiskey. "What made you change your mind?" Eliza thought about it. "I don't know if there was one thing. Maybe it was just, I was tired of being alone, and you seemed like you were tired too. I figured if we were both tired, we might as well be tired together." Caleb laughed. "That's the most romantic thing I've ever heard." "I'm not good at romance." "You're better at it than you think." They passed the bottle back and forth, watching the stars, listening to the night sounds. Inside, Sarah made a small noise in her sleep, and both of them went still, listening, ready to go to her if she needed them. But she settled back down, and they relaxed. "I love our life, Caleb said. "It's not easy, and it's not fancy, but it's ours. And that's enough." "More than enough," Eliza agreed. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. This was what she'd been searching for all along, she realized. Not wealth or security or even happiness exactly. Just this. A place to belong. A person to belong with. A reason to keep going. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving up on me, even when I gave you plenty of reasons to." Caleb kissed the top of her head. "Never. I told you, I'm not going anywhere." And he meant it. They both knew it. Whatever came next, good harvests or bad, sickness or health, joy or sorrow, they'd face it together. The summer ended with the best wheat harvest they'd ever had. They sold most of it for a profit that left them with money to spare. Caleb talked about buying more land, expanding the herd, building a proper house instead of the cramped cabin they'd been living in. "We could do it," he said, sketching plans on a piece of paper. "A real house, 2 stories, enough room for more children if we have them." Eliza looked at the drawings. A year ago, she would have dismissed this as foolish dreaming. But now, looking at what they'd already accomplished, it didn't seem foolish at all. "All right," she said. "Let's build a house." They started construction in September. Caleb hired a crew from town, and together they laid the foundation, raised the frame, built the walls. It took weeks, but slowly the house took shape. Solid, sturdy, bigger than anything Eliza had ever imagined living in. Sarah watched from her basket, gurgling and cooing at the workers. She was crawling now, getting into everything, and Eliza had to keep a constant eye on her to make sure she didn't eat dirt or wander off. "She's fearless," Naomi said one day, watching Sarah try to pull herself up on a chair. "Just like her mother." "I'm not fearless," Eliza said. "Maybe not, but you pretend to be, and that's almost the same thing." By October, the house was finished. It wasn't fancy, just a simple 2-story farmhouse with 4 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a parlor with big windows that let in light. But it was theirs, built with their own hands and their own money, and when they moved in, Eliza felt like she'd finally come home. They spent the first night in the new house sitting in the empty parlor, Sarah asleep between them in her cradle. "We did it," Caleb said. "Yeah," Eliza said. "We really did." She looked around the room, the clean walls, the solid floors, the space they'd created for their family, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the knowledge that whatever struggles came, they could handle them. Together. Winter came again, but this time they were ready. The new house was warm and solid, the supplies were stocked, the animals were sheltered. Sarah was almost a year old now, taking her first wobbly steps, saying her first words, "Mama," and "Dada," and "No," which she used liberally. On a quiet night in December, with snow falling outside and a fire crackling in the hearth, Eliza sat in the rocking chair Caleb had built, nursing Sarah to sleep. Caleb was beside her, working on a wooden toy he was carving for their daughter. "You happy?" he asked without looking up. "Yeah," Eliza said. "I am." And she meant it. For the first time in her life, she was truly, deeply happy. Not because everything was perfect, it wasn't, but because she'd learned that perfection didn't matter. What mattered was this: love, family, the quiet satisfaction of building something that lasted. Sarah's eyes drifted closed, and Eliza carried her to the cradle, tucking her in with care. When she came back, Caleb held out his hand, and she took it, sitting beside him on the floor in front of the fire. "I've been thinking," he said. About? About how far we've come, from those first letters to now. It's like a different life." "It is a different life." "You ever regret it? Taking a chance on me?" Eliza looked at him, really looked at him. At the gray in his hair, the lines around his eyes, the calluses on his hands. He wasn't perfect. Neither was she. But they were perfect for each other. "Not once," she said. And she never would. The years that followed weren't easy, but they were good. That was the thing Eliza came to understand. Good and easy weren't the same thing. Easy would have been giving up, staying alone, protecting herself from the risk of loving someone and losing them. Good was waking up every morning beside a man who'd proven himself over and over, working land that finally felt like it belonged to her, raising a daughter who laughed more than she cried. By the time Sarah turned 3, the farm had transformed completely. What had once been 40 acres of struggling wheat was now a thriving operation. Expanded fields, a productive garden that supplied half the town, a herd of cattle that had grown to 20 head, and a greenhouse that allowed them to grow vegetables year-round. They'd hired permanent help, a young man named Peter who lived in a small cabin Caleb had built near the barn, and during harvest season, they employed half a dozen workers from town. Eliza had learned to delegate, though it didn't come naturally. She still wanted to do everything herself, still felt guilty when she wasn't working from dawn to dusk. But Caleb had a way of reminding her that running a successful farm meant knowing when to step back. "You can't do it all," he said one afternoon when he found her trying to repair a fence while Sarah napped. "That's why we have Peter. Peter's busy with the cattle. Then the fence can wait until tomorrow." "But, Eliza," he took the hammer from her hands, "when's the last time you sat down and did nothing?" She thought about it. "I don't know." "Exactly. Come on." He led her back to the house, sat her down on the porch, and brought her a cup of coffee. "Stay here. Watch the clouds. Breathe. I'll finish the fence." She wanted to argue, but the truth was she was exhausted. So she stayed. And after a while, she realized he was right. The world didn't fall apart when she stopped moving for 5 minutes. Sarah was growing up wild and free, exactly the way Eliza had hoped. She had her mother's stubborn streak and her father's easy smile, and she was afraid of nothing. By the time she was 4, she was helping feed the chickens, collecting eggs, following Caleb around the barn like a shadow. She asked endless questions about everything, all the time, and Caleb answered every single one with patience Eliza didn't know he had. "Why do the chickens lay eggs?" Sarah asked one morning. "Because that's how they make baby chickens," Caleb explained. "But we eat the eggs. How do the baby chickens get born if we eat them?" "The eggs we eat aren't fertilized. They won't become chicks." "What's fertilized mean?" Eliza watched from the doorway, smiling, as Caleb launched into an explanation of chicken reproduction that was way too detailed for a 4-year-old. Sarah listened intently, nodding like she understood every word. "You're going to turn her into a little scientist," Eliza said later. "Better that than ignorant," Caleb said. "I want her to understand how the world works. I don't want her to be afraid of knowledge." "She's not afraid of anything." "Good. Let's keep it that way." But life on the frontier had a way of teaching fear whether you wanted to learn it or not. It happened in the summer when Sarah was 5. A drought had settled over the territory, turning the grass brown and drying up the smaller creeks. They're well held, thank everything, but other farms weren't as lucky. Water became scarce, and with scarcity came desperation. Eliza first noticed something was wrong when she found tracks near the barn one morning, boot prints that weren't Caleb's or Peter's, leading from the road to the well and back again. Someone had come in the night and taken water. She told Caleb, and his face went hard. How much did they take? Not much. A bucket, maybe two. But still, I'll talk to Peter. We'll start taking shifts at night. Keep watch. You think they'll come back? If they're desperate enough, yeah. They came back 3 nights later. Eliza was the one on watch, sitting on the porch with a rifle across her lap, fighting to stay awake. She heard them before she saw them, 2 men moving quietly through the dark, heading straight for the well. She stood up, raised the rifle, and called out, "That's far enough." The men froze. In the moonlight, she could see they were young, maybe early 20s, thin and ragged-looking. "We don't want trouble," one of them said, his voice shaking. "We just need water. There's a creek 2 miles south. It's dried up. Everything's dried up. Our farm, we've got nothing left. My brother's sick. He needs water." Eliza stood there, the rifle steady in her hands, looking at these 2 desperate men who reminded her too much of herself a few years ago. She thought about turning them away, protecting what was hers, staying safe. That's what the old Eliza would have done. But she wasn't that person anymore. She lowered the rifle. "Wait here." She went inside, filled 2 large canteens from their supply, and brought them back out. The men stared at her like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. "Take these," she said, "and don't come back in the middle of the night. If you need water, come during the day and ask. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am," one of them said, his voice thick. "Thank you. Thank you so much." They took the canteens and disappeared into the darkness. Eliza stood there for a long time, wondering if she'd just made a terrible mistake. When Caleb woke up and she told him what happened, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You gave them water. They were desperate. They could have been dangerous. They weren't. They were just scared." She looked at him. "I know what it's like to have nothing. I couldn't turn them away." Caleb pulled her close. "You're a better person than most people out here." "I don't know about that." "I do." Word spread. Within a week, other families started showing up during the day, asking politely if they could take water from the well. Eliza and Caleb said yes every time. They couldn't afford to water the whole territory, but they could afford to help their neighbors survive. The drought broke in late August with a storm that lasted 3 days. When it was over, the creeks were running again, the grass was greening up, and people stopped coming for water. But something had changed. The community remembered who had helped when help was needed. And when Eliza and Caleb needed help in return, when a fire broke out in their barn the following spring, a dozen families showed up to help rebuild it. "You see," Naomi said, watching the neighbors work. "Kindness comes back around." "I didn't do it for that," Eliza said. "I know. That's why it matters." Sarah started school when she was 6, riding into town 3 days a week with Caleb when he had carpentry work. The teacher, a stern woman named Miss Patterson, sent home a note after the first week saying that Sarah was bright but headstrong and needed to learn to follow rules better. "She gets that from you," Caleb said, showing Eliza the note. "She gets it from both of us," Eliza corrected. They sat Sarah down that evening and talked to her about school, about why it was important to listen to her teacher even when she thought she knew better. "But Miss Patterson said women can't be doctors," Sarah protested. "And that's not true. You said I could be anything I wanted." Eliza exchanged a look with Caleb. "You're right. Women can be doctors, but you still have to be respectful, even when someone's wrong. You can disagree without being rude. That's hard. I know, but that's what growing up means. Learning how to be strong and kind at the same time." Sarah thought about this. "Okay, I'll try. That's all we ask." The farm continued to grow. By the time Sarah was 8, they'd bought an additional 40 acres from a neighbor who was retiring. They planted an orchard, apple trees that wouldn't bear fruit for years but represented faith in a future that stretched beyond next season. They built a second barn, expanded the house to add 2 more bedrooms, and installed a real bathtub that didn't require hauling water from the well. Life was good, better than good. Eliza sometimes had to stop and remind herself that this was real, that it wasn't going to disappear the moment she let her guard down. But she'd learned something important over the years. Fear of loss was just another form of prison. She'd spent too much of her life locked up in that prison, and she wasn't going back. One night, when Sarah was 9, Eliza found her daughter sitting on the porch steps, looking up at the stars. "What are you thinking about?" Eliza asked, sitting down beside her. "About how big everything is," Sarah said. "Miss Patterson said there are millions of stars, and some of them are bigger than the sun. Is that true?" "I think so. It makes me feel small." Eliza put her arm around her daughter. "You are small. We all are. But that doesn't mean we don't matter." "How do you know we matter?" It was a big question, the kind Eliza had asked herself 1,000 times in her darkest moments. She thought about how to answer it honestly. "I think we matter because we choose to," she said finally. "Because we get up every morning and we work and we love people and we try to make things better. We matter because we decide to matter." Sarah leaned against her. "I want to matter." "You already do. To me and your father. To everyone who knows you. You matter so much, Sarah. Don't ever forget that." They sat there together, mother and daughter, looking up at the vast sky, feeling small and significant all at once. When Sarah turned 10, Eliza realized with a start that she was the same age Eliza had been when her own mother died. It hit her hard, this awareness of time passing, of how quickly childhood slipped away. She found herself holding Sarah a little tighter, treasuring the moments when her daughter still wanted to be held. "You getting sentimental on me?" Caleb asked one evening, watching Eliza brush Sarah's hair. "Maybe. She's growing up. Too fast." "That's what they do." He came up behind Eliza and wrapped his arms around her waist. "But we've still got time, and we've done a good job so far." "You think?" "I know. Look at her. She's smart, she's kind, she's brave. She's everything we hoped she'd be." Eliza leaned back against him. "We should have another one." Caleb went very still. "What?" "Another child. Sarah shouldn't grow up alone. I did, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone." "Are you sure? You always said one was enough." "I was wrong." She turned to face him. "I want another baby, Caleb, if it's not too late." He smiled, slow and warm. "It's not too late." Their second child, a boy they named Thomas after Eliza's first husband, was born the following spring. The birth was easier this time. Eliza knew what to expect, and her body remembered what to do. Doctor Hayes delivered him in the big house, in the bedroom with windows that let in the morning light, and when she placed the baby in Eliza's arms, Eliza felt a completeness she hadn't known she was missing. Sarah was fascinated by her new brother. She wanted to hold him constantly, wanted to help with everything. Caleb had to remind her to be gentle, that babies were fragile. "I know that," Sarah said indignantly. "I'm not going to break him." "I know you're not. But he's small, so we have to be careful." Sarah looked down at her brother, her expression serious. "I'm going to protect him. Nobody's going to hurt him while I'm around." "That's a good sister," Eliza said, and Sarah meant it. As Thomas grew, she was fiercely protective of him, teaching him everything she knew, defending him from bullies, including him in everything she did. Watching them together, Eliza felt like she'd finally gotten something right. The years rolled on. The farm prospered. Thomas grew into a cheerful, curious boy who loved animals and spent most of his time following Peter around, learning about cattle and horses. Sarah excelled in school, top of her class, already talking about going to university someday, something that would have been unthinkable when Eliza was her age. "Let her go, Caleb said when Eliza expressed worry about Sarah leaving. "We raised her to be independent. We can't hold her back now." "I know, but it's hard. Everything worth doing is hard. You taught me that." Eliza looked at him, this man who'd walked into her life as a stranger and become everything. He had more gray in his hair now, more lines around his eyes. They'd both aged, both bore the marks of years of hard work and harder winters. But he was still the same man who'd risked his life in a storm to save her wheat, still the man who'd chosen her every single day. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said, smiling. "I love you too." When Eliza turned 40, they threw a party at the farm, a real party with neighbors and friends and food and music. Sarah and Thomas had organized most of it, secretly planning for weeks. Eliza stood in the middle of it all, surrounded by people who cared about her and felt overwhelmed by gratitude. Naomi found her standing alone on the porch, catching her breath. "You doing all right?" Naomi asked. "I'm perfect," Eliza said. "I'm just taking it all in. You've come a long way from that angry, scared woman I met 15 years ago. I had a lot of help. You had Caleb, but you did the rest yourself." Naomi squeezed her hand. "You should be proud." "I am," Eliza said, and she meant it. That night, after everyone had gone home and the children were asleep, Eliza and Caleb sat on the porch like they'd done 1,000 times before. The farm stretched out before them in the moonlight, fields and barns and fences, everything they'd built together. "You ever think about how different your life would be if you hadn't answered that ad?" Caleb asked. Eliza thought about it. "I'd probably be dead, or wish I was." "That's dark." "It's true. I was barely surviving when you showed up. Another year alone, and I would have lost everything." "I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for." "Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out." She took his hand. "You saved my life, Caleb." "No, we saved each other." And that was the truth of it. They'd both been drowning when they found each other, both convinced they were better off alone. But together, they'd learned something essential, that strength didn't mean not needing anyone. It meant being brave enough to need someone and trust them not to break you. The seasons continued their cycle. Sarah went off to university in Chicago when she was 18, studying medicine despite everyone who said it was impossible for a woman. She wrote letters home every week, full of stories about her classes and her professors and the city that was so different from the Dakota Prairie. Eliza missed her desperately, but was proud beyond measure. Thomas stayed on the farm, working alongside Caleb, learning the business. He talked about taking over someday, about raising his own family on the land. It was everything Eliza and Caleb had hoped for, a legacy that would outlast them. When Eliza turned 50, she and Caleb took a rare trip away from the farm. They left Thomas in charge and traveled by train to Chicago to visit Sarah. Their daughter had graduated by then, was working at a hospital, engaged to a doctor she'd met during her residency. Walking through the city with Sarah, listening to her talk about her work and her life, Eliza felt a bittersweet mixture of pride and loss. Her daughter didn't need her anymore, not in the way she once had. But that was the point, wasn't it? To raise children who could stand on their own? "You did good, Mama," Sarah said one evening over dinner. "With me and Thomas. With everything. We did our best." It was more than enough. Sarah reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "I know it wasn't easy for you, letting me leave, letting me chase this dream. But thank you. Thank you for believing I could do it." Eliza felt tears sting her eyes. "I always believed in you." "I know. That's what made the difference." On the train ride home, Caleb said, "You all right?" "Yeah, why, is," Eliza said, watching the landscape roll by. "I'm just thinking about how far we've come. From letters to this. It's been quite a journey." "It has." "You ever regret it, taking a chance on me?" "Every single day," he said, deadpan. She smacked his arm. "I'm being serious." He smiled and pulled her close. "Not once. Not ever. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Eliza Ward, and I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat. Even the parts where I was impossible, especially those parts that kept me on my toes." The farm continued to thrive. They'd hired more permanent help over the years, built worker housing, created jobs for families in the area. The operation was bigger than anything Eliza had imagined. Hundreds of acres, multiple barns, dozens of cattle, a vegetable operation that supplied 3 towns. They'd built something that mattered, something that would last. One afternoon, when Eliza was 55, she was working in the garden when she felt a sharp pain in her chest. It passed quickly, but it left her shaken. She didn't tell Caleb, didn't want to worry him, but she started thinking about mortality in a way she hadn't before. She was getting older. They both were. Caleb was 60 now, still strong but slower than he used to be. How much time did they have left? 10 years? 20? However much it was, she wanted to make it count. That night she said, I want to write everything down. Caleb looked up from the book he was reading. Write what down? Our story. How we met. How we built this place. Everything. I want Sarah and Thomas to know. I want their children to know. You planning on going somewhere? No, but someday I will. We both will. And when that happens, I want there to be something left behind besides the farm. I want them to know how we did it. So she started writing. Every evening after dinner, she'd sit at the kitchen table with pen and paper and write down her memories. Some of it was painful. The years after Thomas died, the betrayal by David, the loneliness that had nearly consumed her. But most of it was good. The letters, the first meeting, the storm, the birth of their children, the slow building of a life that had seemed impossible. Caleb would read what she wrote and add his own memories, his own perspective. Together, they created a record of their journey, an honest account of two broken people who'd found a way to heal. Sarah came home for a visit when Eliza was 58, bringing her husband and their two children, a boy and a girl who ran wild through the farm just like their mother had. Watching her grandchildren play, Eliza felt the circle completing itself. They love it here, Sarah said, watching her daughter chase chickens. This is their heritage, Eliza said. They should know where they come from. Will you tell them about how you and Papa built all this? I'm writing it down for them, so they'll always know. Sarah hugged her mother tight. Thank you for everything, for being strong enough to survive, for being brave enough to love again, for showing me what's possible. I just did what I had to do. No, you did what most people wouldn't have the courage to do. You chose hope over fear. That's not nothing, Mama. That's everything. The years continued. Caleb's hair went completely white. Eliza's hands grew stiff with arthritis, making it harder to work. But they adapted. They slowed down but didn't stop. The farm was in good hands with Thomas, who ran it with the same dedication his parents had shown. When Eliza turned 65, she finished writing their story. She gave copies to both children, along with instructions to share it with their own children someday. This is our legacy, she told them. Not just the farm, but this, the story of how we built it, the story of what's possible when you refuse to give up. That winter was harsh, one of the coldest on record. Caleb developed a cough that wouldn't go away. Dr. Hayes, now old herself but still practicing, said it was pneumonia, said he needed to rest, to stay inside and let his body heal. He did, reluctantly, and after a few weeks he improved. But Eliza saw how the illness had aged him, how it had taken something out of him that he couldn't get back. They were both old now, both running on borrowed time. One night, lying in bed beside him, she said, I'm not ready to lose you. I'm not going anywhere yet, he said. Promise me something. Anything. When it's time, when one of us goes, the other one doesn't give up, doesn't stop living. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, That's a hard promise to make. I know, but I need to hear it. All right, I promise. But you have to promise the same thing. I promise. They held each other in the dark. Two old people who'd loved each other through everything, making promises they hoped they'd never have to keep. Caleb lived another 5 years. He died peacefully in his sleep at 72, his hand in Eliza's, their children at his bedside. The funeral was enormous. Half the territory showed up to pay respects to a man who'd helped build their community, who'd given work to their families, who'd been a steady presence in uncertain times. Eliza stood at his grave and didn't cry. Not because she wasn't sad, she was devastated, but because Caleb had never liked dramatics. He'd want her to be strong. After everyone left, Sarah and Thomas tried to convince her to come live with one of them. I'm staying here, Eliza said firmly. Mama, you can't run the farm alone, Thomas said. I'm not running it. You are. But I'm not leaving this place. This is my home. This is where I belong. They didn't argue. They knew her too well. Eliza lived another 12 years after Caleb died. She stayed on the farm, in the house they'd built together, surrounded by their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She walked the fields every day, checking on things, offering advice, telling stories about the old days. She taught her granddaughter how to plant a garden. She taught her grandson how to fix a fence. She told them about their grandfather, about how he'd shown up as a stranger and become everything. She made sure they understood that love wasn't something that just happened. It was something you chose every day, over and over. On a warm afternoon in early September, just after her 83rd birthday, Eliza sat on the porch of the farmhouse and looked out over the land she'd spent her life building. The fields were golden with wheat, just like they'd been that first summer when Caleb arrived. The garden was bursting with vegetables. The barns were full of cattle. Everything was thriving. Thomas found her there an hour later, sitting peacefully in her chair, a slight smile on her face. She'd died the way she'd lived, on her own terms, in her own time, in the place she loved most. They buried her beside Caleb under a cottonwood tree they'd planted together 40 years earlier. Sarah read from the manuscript Eliza had written, the story of two broken people who'd found each other and built something beautiful. My mother taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, Sarah said, her voice carrying over the crowd. It's the choice to keep going despite it. She was afraid of everything, loss, betrayal, failure, but she did it anyway. She loved anyway. She built anyway. And because she did, all of us are here. The farm continued for generations. Sarah's children ran it, then their children. The original house stood for over 100 years, a monument to what two people could build when they refused to give up on each other. And somewhere in every generation, someone would read Eliza's manuscript and understand the truth she'd spent her life learning, that the bravest thing you can do isn't facing down danger or conquering fear. It's choosing to love in a world that will break your heart. It's choosing to build when everything around you is falling apart. It's choosing to trust when every experience has taught you not to. It's choosing hope over safety, connection over isolation, love over survival. Because in the end, survival isn't enough. You have to live, you have to risk everything for the chance at something real. And when you do, when you take that leap despite the fear, despite the pain, despite everything that tells you not to, you might just discover that you're stronger than you ever imagined. That you can survive anything as long as you're not facing it alone. That love isn't weakness, it's the most courageous thing in the world. Eliza Thornfield had learned that lesson the hard way. But she'd learned it. And in learning it, she'd built a legacy that lasted far beyond her lifetime, not just in the farm or the family, but in the story itself. The story of a woman who'd been broken by life and had chosen to heal, who'd been betrayed and had chosen to trust again, who'd been alone and had chosen to love. And in making those choices, she hadn't just survived the frontier, she'd conquered it.